Albert Einstein said, "Don't think about why you question, simply don't stop questioning." Welcome to Curated Questions. I am your host, Ken Woodward. And these questions are not mathematical equations, but rather a resource to encounter personal reflection and growth. As Tupac Shakur stated, even the genius asks questions. Now, let's engage the questioning community. Greetings, Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I am a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you are here. Today's conversation is with Cal Fussman. That's Fussman. Cal has lived an exciting and passionate life in which questions have played a key role. His experiences place him at the top of the list of the most interesting of people. He has either been there and done that himself or hung out with those who have. Cal grew up in Long Island, New York, and attended college in Missouri. He went from writing sports articles and having drinks with the likes of Hunter S. Thompson to Worldwide Wanderer for 10 years, to writing for Esquire magazine and interviewing Muhammad Ali, Mikhail Gorbachev, Serena Williams, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, and other icons of the last 75 years. To a decade of eating daily breakfast with communications master Larry King, to hosting the Big Questions podcast and speaking about how to harness the power of questions. I first encountered Cal and his love of questions and storytelling on the Tim Ferriss podcast in 2017. He has been on my must-interview list since I first conceived of this podcast. Please seek out his work through whatever means, because his stories are unbelievable. There's no way we can get them all in on this show, and the crystallized nuggets of wisdom are priceless. Cal, welcome to Curated Questions.
Great to be with you, Kenneth.
Excellent. So with your being a sports writer, world traveler, world-class interviewer, speaker, podcaster, how has your use of questions changed, but also remained the same through these various chapters in your life?
Well, I would have to say, if I took you back to the start, it was pure childhood curiosity. So let me take you to November 1963, and I am second grade, just turned 7 years old the week before. Smallest guy in my class, and the teacher, Miss Jaffe, leaves the room. Comes back about 2 minutes later, a minute later, completely different person. Her face was like chalk, and she started talking in a voice that was so calm, it almost made you nervous. And that's when we found out that President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, had been shot. And there's a question that is going to change my life because of that. I didn't realize it when I ran home from school. We just wanted to know what happened. And we all turned on the TV, and we found out that, in fact, President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. A little later, that Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson had stepped up, taken the oath of office, and was now the new president. So here's where the questions start to give form. My mom and dad didn't know how I was going to take what happened today. It was the first time I'd ever had to deal with death. And they called me over and said, "We just want you to know that it was a terrible tragedy, but this happened before in our country's history. And we want you to know that there's a plan in place, and you can get a good night's sleep tonight, because tomorrow morning you'll be having breakfast just like you did last Saturday. Go out and play just like you did last Saturday. Everything's going to be okay." So they went over to talk to my brother, and now the question is starting to form in my mind. And this is pure childhood curiosity. And I'll explain to you how naive I was at that time. I thought if you had a middle initial, that meant you got to be president. because the only people I ever heard of with middle initials were presidents. So Dwight D. Eisenhower, Harry S. Truman, Franklin D. Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, and now Lyndon B. Johnson is the new president. And so I'm thinking, what's this guy feeling right now? How does he feel? Is he happy to be the president? Because he always knew he was going to be the president. Or is he sad to be the president because, well, he's only the president because of the assassination? But then I thought, what if he's scared to be the president because they might try and get him too? So I had these childhood curiosity questions revolving around me, and I picked up a piece of paper and pen, and I just started writing. Dear President Johnson, how does it feel? Are you happy? Are you sad to be the president? Are you scared to be the president? I might have thrown in a few more possibilities. And the timing was perfect for these questions because I had just learned how to address an envelope. And I knew where the envelopes and the stamps were, so I went and got one. President Lyndon B. Johnson, the White House, got a stamp, licked it. That's the way we used to do it. Put it in the top right-hand corner, my address in the top left-hand corner. And I didn't tell anybody about it. I went out the next day to play, brought the letter with me, dropped it in the mailbox. Well, after a few weeks, basically forgot about it. But 6 months later, my mom came running into the apartment with her right hand over her head, and an envelope was in it. And it was from the White House. And it was addressed to me. It was from the president. And
Nice.
we opened it up, and the beautiful thing about this letter was it was not written to a second grader. It was written with dignity. And I knew that when we got to the second sentence, there was something like, in answer to your query, and I had no idea what a query was.
Nice, right?
But I saw that my home was now being filled with people who all wanted to hold this letter to the president, or from the president. And principal of school was calling me up, asking me to bring it to school. And I just realized that the smallest guy in a second grade class was suddenly a very big man. And that was, when I think back on it, the inaugural question. And it shaped my life going forward because I always knew from that point on that a good question could get you to the most powerful person on earth, and that I would be asking those kind of questions for the rest of my life. So that's how it started. And then over time, it began to evolve.
Yeah, it would be life-changing to have that letter arrive or that kind of response. And to your point on dignity, that is a lovely thing for a second grader to be addressed that way. And so that evolution, was that intentional as you obviously got older and you're in different circumstances? Were you intentional about these steps, or was it a trial and error kind of scenario? How did that evolve, or what were some of those steps?
Well, something amazing happened that apparently it doesn't happen to many people. Not that many people know what they want to do or be when they're 6 years old or 7 years old. From that moment on, I knew I was going to be asking questions and telling stories about the answer, because part of what came in the whole package with the letter from the president was a story. And if you asked about me, I could tell you how I got a letter from the president. So I always knew I would be asking questions and then telling stories about the answers I got, which basically meant that I wanted to be a journalist. And at the time, this was, before the age of like cable TV, and newspapers were like one of the biggest ways of communicating, asking questions, getting answers. They not only came out every day, but like I was living in New York, and my dad would come home from work in New York City and would bring 3 or 4 newspapers with him. And so I became embedded with this idea of seeing my face in a newspaper, writing stories. And that's how I went to journalism school. What happened is, because I knew I was going to go to journalism school, I was at a conference at Columbia University, and the sports editor of the New York Times was speaking. And afterward, I just walked up to him and said, "Hey, if I want to do what you do, where do I go?" And he said, "University of Missouri, where else?" And I said, "Okay." And I applied and got accepted. And the next thing I knew, I was walking down the street with a suitcase in my hand, looking up the Kramer Hall, saw a young guy out the third door window. And I said, "Is this Kramer Hall?" And he said, "Yep, come on in." And so that was, when I think about it, a question that actually influenced my life, because the first time I really traveled.
Hmm.
And simply just asking somebody, am I in the right place? And getting an affirmation. It was sort of a verbal hug. "Yeah, come on in, you belong."
Hmm.
And I felt like I belonged from the moment I got there. And so questions come in a lot of different ways, and such a basic question compared to the first. When I was 7 years old and I was asking what goes on in the mind of a man who's just become president due to an assassination, this was just, "Hey, do I belong here?" "Yes, you do." And very basic, but important. And I know it's important because I still remember the moment. And that, more than 40 years ago. So almost 50 years ago. So it just goes to show you that a basic question that is not interrogating anybody, just pure curiosity, can do something memorable. Now, once I was there, then came journalism school, and you started to learn how to interview people that want to be a sports writer. So interviewing players and coaches, and had an interesting experience with a football coach at the University of Nebraska. His name is Tom Osborne.
Okay.
So not much longer after I got to the university, I started to travel to football games with a whole crew of reporters. Now, being the new guy, like, I wasn't allowed to sit in the press box or write anything, but I was just happy to be there. And so for the first, I went to every college football game while I was there. And there would be about 5 or sometimes 6 of us packed in a car, and we would travel hundreds of miles to go from Missouri to Oklahoma or Nebraska or Kansas. And it was, I believe, the 5th week of the season. And in the last game, the 4th, Missouri had been destroyed. So like 52-20. And we're going up to Nebraska, which was like the 5th ranked team in the country. And it had won many national championships recently. And whole stadium at Nebraska just would be filled with people dressed in red. And they were the like, most devoted fans you can imagine. And everybody in the car is telling me, like, you've never seen anything like this. Like, this is the big time. And so I'm up at the top of the stands watching it. And it's a magnificent experience. Just seeing all these people, like the whole state comes together. And I'm watching this game, and it should kind of be a rout because one team's undefeated and is almost, it's in the top 5. And the other is just middling about and just got creamed. During this game, the coach of the Missouri team decides to change the quarterback because they're not moving the ball down the field.
Okay. Right.
And he moves the fullback who's just basically blocking to tailback. And just by doing those two things, like the team completely changed. They were completely connected. And I don't know how, but the defense had held on early in the game. They were only down 10-0. And then once these players changed positions, Missouri scored like 3 straight times and won the game. It was a total shock.
Wow.
And so I'm watching this stand. The fans can't make any sense of this. And I know I got to find out what just happened.
Yeah.
I know I'm supposed to be a fan. I have no press pass. I got to get in that locker room and ask some questions. Now, the people, the other writers that were in the car, they would not have liked that one bit because I was a freshman. I was a rookie. You're not supposed to do that. You got to pay your dues.
Yeah. Right.
But I just run down to the field. I notice a photographer who I had met along the way. And I said, are you using that press pass right now? And he said, nah, I've already taken my photos. I'm done. So I get the press pass and I just start walking toward the clubhouse where, seeing all the other reporters going. And
Right.
basically the crowd and all the people in Nebraska are just shell-shocked. And so I got this pass around and I just sort of walk with everybody. And there is Tom Osborne, University of Nebraska coach. And some of the people that I was in the car driving to the game see me. And that they're working at like the same newspaper. And it's not, they don't give me a look of, hey, this is amazing you got in here. It's, what are you doing here? You're the rookie. You're not allowed, like 2 years from now, you can get in here.
Right.
But there's nothing they can really say but just glare at me like, just shut up and don't do anything wrong. And it's going to come back on us. And so they start interviewing the coach and questions going in and out. And at one point, I just looked at Tom Osborne and I said, these 2 players, one of them was on the bench and another was in a different position. How could you possibly prepare for what happened?
Right.
And his eyes just look up at the ceiling. I've noticed this many times over the years. When somebody's eyes go up to the right, it means they're searching deep inside.
Okay.
And he was thinking about, how to answer it. And then he started to talk. And it wasn't important what he said. What was important was that everybody was madly scribbling it down. And in that moment, the coach in Nebraska said, you belong here. And so none of the other people in the locker room were looking at me like, you scallywag, how'd you get in here? Like when I walked out of that room, I was completely accepted. And so there's just another case of a very basic question that the sports writer would have asked, but I was the only one who did ask it. And it just filled me with the confidence that I have to this day. It's like, you belong. This is who you are. And then like you start adding things up. Yeah, like the president wrote me back. One of the top Hall of Fame coach, taking my questions very seriously. So you can start to see how a confidence would develop when you see those reactions.
Why is it that no one else asked that question? Because if that was a pivotal moment, could it have been perceived that this was a critical question of him? It seemed like to me that was like the linchpin question for the entire interview for everyone. And I don't know why all these quote experienced people that have earned their stripes, why they didn't ask that question.
Well,
any ideas?
It's not that nobody was in that area. It was more about from, I believe, the side of the journalists from Nebraska. They were kind of shell-shocked. And it was more like, how could this have happened?
Okay.
So, and that, I think, was kind of the refrain, like, how did this happen? How did this happen? How did this happen? And then I came in with, how could you have prepared for that?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a different way of looking at the question.
Right.
And it was a way of looking at it that I suppose the coach would prefer, because it's not being stated for why did this go wrong. Mm-hmm. It's making the person think, yeah, how could I have prepared for that? And that was those few seconds looking up at the ceiling. That's what he was wondering. And when you ask the question that way, he's just as curious about the answer as I was, and everybody who's listening. And so that's why the question really worked. It's why nobody resented me for asking it, and why after that I would have the good housekeeping seal of approval. And so when I trace these questions back, they may seem, well, that's just a regular question you would ask at a football game. But it just meant something bigger because of the moment and because of what I needed to happen in order to evolve from one place where people were looking at me as the writer who wasn't really a writer, he was just a fan in stands, to somebody that when he asks a question, it's going to be paid attention to.
Nice. As you explain that question or how you phrase that question, and I think about much of your other work, it seems as though you generally go that direction of the positive view on things. I'm sure that you've asked the hard questions. I'm not questioning that, but based on your Esquire magazine work, it was trending towards, let me understand who you are as a person, not so much I'm here to get you or kind of take the negative side of things.
Yeah, that's a good observation. And another sports figure, you got to be a little older probably to remember him. He was the owner of the New York Yankees, George Steinbrenner, and he had just a huge reputation back in the day. He would fire many managers in a season. He did anything he could to get on the back page of the tabloids so that he was like in control of things. And I went up to interview him, or I went to Tampa. It's where he was living. And after the session, he rode down in the elevator with me. And he just looked at me and he said, you ask the toughest questions in the nicest way.
Hmm.
And I thought, yeah, that's a good way to describe who I am.
So what goes into your preparation then to not just take the easy way of asking maybe what might be perceived as a hard or critical question, but then formatting it in such a way that it's easier to be received and still kind of get at the heart of the matter?
Well, I guess part of it is asking people what they want to know about themselves, but often don't ask. And so I'm just tapping into their curiosity about themselves when I ask those questions. And generally, people who are like really intelligent find that approach really useful. It's almost like a good therapist because they're learning something new about themselves.
So your intuition, insight into being able to get to that, is that based on research that you do? So then it becomes, hey, I've heard you have these discussions and there always seems to be this gap. And is that one of your techniques that you do?
Yeah, I do a lot of research, and this goes back way before the days of YouTube and where you could get a lot of interviews on video and watch them. Back then, you would read newspapers or magazines, and after a while, you can try and put together people's stories from what you're gathering. You can talk to people who know them, but ultimately, what happens, the way I do it, is after I accumulate all the information I can, I just sit down with a pen and a notebook, and I just start writing down questions, going back to the first question I ever asked, where it got me the letter from the president, and just questions that just make me curious. And then I walk around with these questions for a few days. I don't memorize them. I just kind of breathe them in by osmosis. And when the interview is about to approach, I symbolically rip the questions up just so
Wow.
I'm going in with the questions inside me, but I'm not using them as a roadmap. I'm not depending on them to take me from A to Z, because I've noticed a lot of people who do that, that show up with legal pads, and you often see the person in the interview leaning over to see what the questions might be. But more than that, I think it can discourage the follow-up questions because it can make you lazy. Just know, okay, this is question 6. I know what I'm going to ask after that. I know what I'm going to ask after that. When really you want to be listening to what they say so that you can pivot to a follow-up question. Now, it may be that my follow-up questions were questions I originally thought of, but
Right.
there's no pad on the table. I'm just sitting there. I'm not taking any notes. So it just seems like a conversation. And that makes people feel comfortable. And my approach is to make people feel like they are not being interviewed, that we're just having a conversation.
Yeah. Okay. In some of the things you've talked about here, you've mentioned belonging or some variation of belonging. How do you use, I guess there's a couple of components here. So let's first go at it from, is that true that you're using questions as a form to create belonging or foster belonging? Is that a fair assumption?
Well, this goes to a next stage of the evolution. Like after I graduated from college, I worked at 2 newspapers, the Miami Herald and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then went to New York to write for magazines. This is all in like 3 years.
Oh,
a
okay.
year at each newspaper. And then this magazine was just a great, great place to work because you had writers like Hunter S. Thompson, like gonzo journalist. Johnny Depp played in the movie.
Amazing.
Showing up to write in the magazine and be throwing back shots with him at the bar after work. And what happened was the next questions or the next way of evolving the questions occurred when this magazine that I'm talking about, it's called Inside Sports, folded. It was a critical success, but not so economically. And I didn't quite know what I was going to do in my life because it was just a beautiful place to work. And it allowed me to like go interview the Super Bowl champs or be at big championship fight, all the things that I wanted to do. Talk to all of the Hall of Famers I ever wanted to meet. And now all of a sudden it's out of business and I didn't really know where I was going to go from there. So I told my mom, I think I'm going to just take some time off and just travel a little. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a wonderful idea, Cal. And when she said it, she didn't know that I wasn't coming back for about 10 years. I
think that's a fair assumption for any parent.
Yeah. Now, I did come back and say hello, but the trip was very addictive. And the interesting about it was that everything that transpired happened because of 4 words, which is, I had no money, but very little money. So what this meant was the trip basically transpired as follows. I go to a train station or a bus station, buy a ticket to either the next destination or someplace coming up. It really didn't matter where it was going. What mattered to me was the trip down the aisle, because I'm walking down that aisle and I don't know where I'm going to sit, but I got to find an empty seat next to somebody who looks like I can trust, and somebody who looks like they can trust me. Because I know once I pick that one seat, train's going to start rolling and conversation's going to start. And once that conversation starts, by the time it ends, I basically need for them to invite me home. Because otherwise, I got no roof over my head. I don't have money to stay in hotels every night. So I'm going to tell you how seriously I took this. I'm walking down that aisle. I see a beautiful woman with an empty seat next to her. She has no rings on her fingers, smiling at me. Could be a supermodel. I just walked right on by because there was just no way she was taking me home. But that grandma in the back, that 83-year-old toothless grandma and hungry, now she can be a winner. Mm-hmm. And so and grandma did take me in, teach me all about goulash and set up a meal in front of her family. And at this meal, I was at the head of the table and everybody was watching as I brought my first taste of Hungarian goulash to my lips. And they saw smile, lift my cheeks, and my eyes closed with rapture, and they all just started cheering. He loves grandma's goulash. And all the people at the table start to come over to me, and they're very curious. Like a party breaks out. And it lasts for days. And then at the party, somebody would then ask, have you ever tasted like homemade apricot brandy? I mean, no. Well, you got to taste my dad's homemade apricot brandy. It's one of the best things you'll ever taste in the world. Lives about 45 minutes from here. You got to come home and taste it. Okay. We go there and another party breaks out. And basically, that's how I got passed around the world for 10 years. People just invited to a party, seeing somebody they didn't expect to encounter from another side of an ocean. And again, this before like the Berlin Wall came down and everybody was split up. So I was kind of an oddity. And people wanted to talk to me. If you were learning English, it was a rare find.
Gotcha.
And so that's how I got around the world for 10 years without a home. And then I met the woman who would become my wife. And that kind of ended the trip. But it set up a different set of questions.
Okay.
And those questions revolved around the interviews that I did for Esquire magazine that you talked about before.
Yeah.
And the way the questions evolved really harkened back to those bus rides and train rides with people, because I took that style and I brought it into these interviews with people like Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, or many presidents from Carter to Trump, to business leaders like Richard Branson, Jack Welch at the time, Jeff Bezos, to athletes, Muhammad Ali. And, they were all used to being interviewed by journalists, but somehow this approach of coming in and sitting next to them, like we were riding on a train together.
Yeah.
It's very different.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it appeared in the magazine was very different. I was a question and answers column called What I've Learned, but they didn't include the questions. So you're looking at the answers, wondering, what did he have to answer? And so that was the next evolution. And it keeps on evolving because now I go into businesses and I do workshops to show people how to connect in a time of remote work. Because,
okay, right.
You think, we have Zoom calls and we're connected, but it's very hard for people who are working at a distance to connect, certainly the way people used to. And so I use questions to show them how to understand the stories of the people they're working with so that they can better collaborate. And it's same basic process, because you're pulling out the things in people in a helpful way. If you can connect better, then you're going to collaborate better.
Absolutely.
I've seen this happen again and again. And then afterwards, like companies report like revenue spikes because their teams are together, coming together. And I can tell you of times where people who didn't feel comfortable telling their stories, I got up on stage and they told their stories and got standing ovations, and it changed their working life, because people who were in the company and really didn't know who they were, all of a sudden were standing up and applauding. Anytime she sent out an email after that, anytime somebody saw her in a Zoom call after that, it was just a different experience.
Absolutely.
So now using questions to show people how to best connect so that they can get the most out of themselves and the most out of their collaborations.
Okay. Is that like a list of 5 questions that you always use? Is it a heart posture, a worldview? What kind of structure are you putting around that?
Well, everybody had a different story. And generally, stories are focused on vulnerability. And so finding a vulnerable moment that the person ultimately was able to turn around and be the same way you see in any movie where a main character shows up kind of vulnerable. They have an intention to get to a better place. Obstacles appear. A mentor shows up, gives them advice, and more obstacles appear. But ultimately, through their intention, through the advice that they get, through the journey, they make a transformation and achieve what they'd hoped for. And so if everybody can tell that story, you're now looking in on somebody and their difficulty that's been overcome, and you can understand something about the person, and you can feel for them. And off people knowing each other's stories, that's where you can get into deeper conversations. And it's much easier for serendipity to flow once you're connected like that.
Gotcha.
I had a guy tell me, I went to a workshop and everybody in the company was remote. This was sort of right after the pandemic. And he was saying how he would go on these Zoom calls and see somebody new. And if they said something that he didn't like or didn't find was right for him, he just stopped trusting them. And I said, you think you'd feel that way if the person worked next to you and you knew that your kids went to the same elementary school and you went down the elevator and talked about commonality? And he said, I'm sure I would. I just can't help it. When I'm at a distance and I just don't feel right about something that somebody says, my worldview of the person is completely changed. And so, that's one of the things that I try to break apart so that people can get to know themselves and their coworkers better. And that way they're comfortable when they come together.
Yeah.
And better collaborations are going to happen because that's the place where you have a place of trust and understanding, and you can build off that.
And no doubt in that building of trust and being able to extend yourself on some vulnerability, no doubt that was a big piece of what you were doing in your interview with world leaders and the who's who, be able to connect with them.
Absolutely. So if you look at it through that lens, none of the questions I'm asking are to downgrade a person, make them feel bad. You're using the questions to look at what they've learned. And a lot of times when you make your biggest leaps forward in knowledge, it's because of your biggest mistakes. So the stories are the most interesting, but because of the way they turn out, there's like a pride at the end of it. It's like getting to the end of a good movie. And so there's like admiration from one person to the next.
Yeah.
And I think that's why these workshops go so well, because people can feel comfortable just like the people I was interviewing, even though the questions may not have been so easy.
There's a little bit of looking for the hero's journey in all of us.
Exactly. 100%.
I think it was in your honoring podcast of Larry King, where you had mentioned that he would go in almost blank on his interviews with people. He didn't do a lot of research. Well, probably didn't have a lot of time over the like thousands of hours that he had of actual interview time. But that same kind of thing is it's just that innate curiosity of let me engage with who's in front of me and start to learn.
Yeah, he hated to do extensive research because he thought that it crimped his childhood curiosity. And he wanted to go into the interview with pretty much the same questions in mind that the viewer would have. And the viewer wasn't sitting around doing all that research. They're just basic questions from childhood curiosity. And so that was his style. You know, everybody has a different style. Charlie Rose used to go in with like so much information, it almost seemed like he was talking to his guests as a peer. When obviously he's just really well researched. So everybody has different skills. You know, Oprah Winfrey has got an earpiece in, and she's got camera in front of her, got an audience in front of her, and a TV audience. Very different from, say, me sitting down with somebody, just putting aside a couple of recorders and not even looking down at them as if they're not even there. And just making the person feel like we're just having an intimate conversation. Now, and it's got to be kind of hard for Oprah to do that when you got an audience full of people.
Well, that's
cameras in your face. So everybody's got to do it their own way. Barbara Walters, very famous. She would script her interviews with index cards and know exactly what question was coming after next. That was like complete opposite of Larry King. He had no idea what was going to come up. So everybody you learn does it their own way. And there's so many ways to be good at it.
I guess it's an encouragement for folks to find a style that works for you and just keep playing with that and honing that style. Is that a fair conclusion?
Exactly. Just be natural. And do what makes you feel comfortable and what gets good results. Because really at the bottom of it is trust. If the person you're interviewing doesn't trust you, it's not going to be a good interview. No, it could be a confrontational one, but I'm not sure you're going to get deepest answers. You'll probably just get pushed back and maybe even get into a fight.
Gotcha.
So
good.
Why fight? The idea is to find out what's going on deep inside the person.
I was recently talking with Derek Sivers, and he had mentioned that oftentimes folks will say, who's the first person that comes to mind being most successful? And he's like, generally the first answers are just not good. They're kind of reactionary, or they're kind of what we've been kind of force fed. Like, let's start to dig a little bit, get to the second or third one. Those are where you really start to find more perhaps true answers for the individuals.
Yeah, the follow-up's a key. Because people are still maybe thinking about the first answer. And we may take the second question to make them further aware of where they want to go, may be able to connect it with what they were thinking. And the more you do this, the more they're going to zone in on the answer. And so they may get to a much deeper place and they were when starting. The way I like to describe it is sort of like digging for gold. If you put your shovel down, take a shovel full of dirt and throw it off the side and you don't see any gold, you can take 2 steps to your right and do the same thing. And if you don't see any gold there, you can take 2 steps to your right and do the same thing. But you may never find any gold that way. You got to go to one spot and keep digging. Maybe you start to see a little piece of a nugget. And so you put your shovel down in the same place again, and then a few more times, and maybe a nugget comes up.
Well, along those lines, as far as camping out and mining for the gold, have there been any particular questions that you have carried with you through your life, whether it's just kind of personal questions or things that you've wrestled with that you've sought to mine?
Well, I'm always looking for, who is this person? What made this person? What are the events that shaped that person's life? So it's just figuring out what happened to the person along the way. And, quite often what happens in this landscape is people get known for a certain reason. And then every time they get interviewed, the questions are about the reason that everybody has seen before. And I always try to find the stories that are underneath what made the person become who they became. It just seems to be done less and less and less. And the focus is more on what everybody knows or has seen and just responding to it.
I know that your conversation with Mikhail Gorbachev, you had it nicked down to one question, essentially. And that, as you mentioned, kind of the framework of somebody's life. And you dialed in on this one question and asked about his dad, and that opened up the floodgates and the additional time. Have there been any other instances where you found that kind of your research paid off in such rich dividends?
It happens all the time. It just, in that case, that was an example where I thought I was going to have an hour and a half to interview him. And shortly before I walked in, publicist told me I would only have 10 minutes. And so as I walked in, I knew that my only chance of coming away with the column that I wrote was to ask him something that made him curious about himself. And so that he would want to continue the conversation. And so I was able to do that by asking about his dad. And he told me a story that dated back to World War II when his father got called to serve in the Russian army. And when he did, it brought back that flood of memories. And again, same point. Everybody else who was coming in to interview him that day was asking about Ronald Reagan, the president who we forged a bond with to end the Cold War,
Right.
Abolishing nuclear weapons, world events. And I don't think anybody was coming to ask the question that would remind him of a moment in his childhood where his dad was going off to war and his dad bought everyone in the family a cup of ice cream before he left. And just the memory of that ice cream made the interview different from all the others. And he wanted to keep it going. And he did keep it going for more than a half an hour. And hey, I was able to get the information I needed. So it really comes back to these same themes of looking for questions that are going to make people more curious about themselves than they were before they came into the interview. And the more curious they come about themselves, the more they want to hear the next question. And so it's just a recurring cycle of more questions, more thoughtful answers. They want more questions. And then you're just in a conversation. You forget you're in an interview, and you can only hope that somebody doesn't say, well, we got other things booked. Time's up, which is kind of where I'm at right now. But I really do appreciate your questions. It really brought me back to thinking about the way that I do what I do. And I see how it's changed, but I also see what's embedded in every step of the evolution.
That is beautiful. Thank you. And very much do appreciate your time. So as we make that transition, where are the best places for folks to reach out to you?
People can reach out to me at calfussman.com with any questions. They can also, if they are working at a company where they want to bring their teams together, if they have teams of remote workers, if they're hiring remote workers, it's good to get everybody together. So once they connect better, they can collaborate better. And all they got to do is go to calfussman.com, send me a note, and let's see if we can make some things happen.
Make the magic happen.
Make
Beautiful.
the magic happen.
Cal, thank you so very much for being a part of the Curated Questions family. I am grateful for those who have joined us on the other side of the speakers. Thank you for being here. This has been such a memorable conversation. Cal is a remarkable human in the pursuit of inspiring others, building connections, and sharing the power of questions. This is where we get to channel our inner Cal to explore our own curiosity and build connections. Please check out Cal's podcast, Big Questions, to see his interviewing skills on full display. And for those who would like to invite Cal's insight into a corporate setting, please reach out directly at calfussman.com. For all of us, please take all you have learned here and be a light to those around you. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, share, or comment about something that resonated. This action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. Until next time, keep questioning.